But so by then, though, Zarqawi is a name that some people in the West have heard. Now, but not shortly before that, he's actually, except to Jordanian intelligence and maybe the CIA to some degree, nobody really has heard of him. No American citizen just following the news had probably heard of Zarqawi until Colin Powell goes to speak to the United Nations to make the case essentially for the invasion of Iraq. But what exactly happened there, and why was it that this obscure terrorist ends up as part of that speech to the UN?
We all remember that speech, and that's where the weapons of mass destruction claim was made before the UN Security Council in a very powerful way. It turned out that was completely wrong intelligence. But at the same time, the other link we tried to make in that speech was to connect al-Qaeda, so the authors of the 9/11 attack, with Saddam Hussein's government. There wasn't much evidence. It was very circumstantial. There was an office at the Pentagon, the Office of Special Plans. It was trying to argue that there were connections and Saddam was somehow in cahoots with some of these al-Qaeda terrorists. The best strand of evidence they had was this guy named Zarqawi, who had been living in northern Iraq. He was essentially in Iraqi territory, even if it was forbidden for Saddam Hussein to go there. But he had past associations with Osama bin Laden. So it was a plausible connection, and Colin Powell plays this up very big in his speech. He actually put Zarqawi's picture up on the big screen saying, this is our poster child, this is what we're worried about, this nexus between a dictator and a very dangerous terrorist group. It turns out it was completely wrong because Zarqawi had no connection with the Iraqis at all. They were studying him just like we were studying him. They were afraid of him, and they certainly had no influence over him, and they weren't giving him anything. But that became part of the pretense that precipitated our invasion of Iraq. By doing that, we not only sort of set this conflict in motion, but we also gave this guy great celebrity. And this is actually, interestingly, the one part of the case that the CIA got right. Because there were analysts at the agency who knew Zarqawi. They knew what his story was. They understood that he was a bad guy and dangerous in his own way, but they also knew he had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. And the wishful thinking, I think, was that with people in the Bush administration, particularly in the Pentagon, wanting to draw that connection, grasping at the smallest shreds of evidence to try to make this case that somehow Saddam Hussein had been part of 9/11 or somehow he could help al-Qaeda. And that was a very important part of the case for the American people, to say that there was some link between 9/11 and this guy we wanted to take over, to knock out of Baghdad. But it ended up having enormous consequences, and these this chain of events all gets launched really with the invasion of Iraq a few months later.
Interestingly enough, in the previous episode of this program, we had as our guest Eric Edelman, who was the National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney at the time that these decisions were being made. The very first thing he said was, I have no doubt that Iraq is better without Saddam Hussein, so that may be true. But then he said, I have no doubt that he was working on weapons of mass destruction programs. And then a few seconds later he said the programs were ongoing, there's no question that he'd produced these weapons in the past, had used them on his neighbors and his own population, that's true. But then we had every reason to believe he was still planning to develop those programs. It essentially was a sort of reaffirmation of the speech that also gave us Zarqawi. But as a national security reporter, who's followed all this, what's your reaction to that?
Well, it's consistent, that's for sure. I mean, Dick Cheney's memoir coming out just a couple of years ago essentially made the same justification that, well, we didn't find WMD. In fact, Cheney acknowledges that. But he still believes that they did the right thing based on the intelligence they had. And they also do think that history will judge them fairly or show them being right in their decision. That's a much harder argument to make now, given the mess that the Middle East is in. I don't know of any analysts, even the intelligence community, that follow this pretty closely, that see it as anything other than a disaster that really unleashed forces that we're having to deal with for decades afterward.